There is an old saying among the species of the Galactic Accord. It goes something like this. Never sit across a table from a human and assume you understand what they are capable of. Because by the time you figure it out, the game is already over and the human already won 3 moves ago. Most species heard that warning. Most species laughed at it. After all, humans were small. Humans were soft. Humans did not have armored scales like the Vrethkai. They did not have 4 arms like the Dorvani. They could not see in total darkness like the Nelith. On paper, humans were among the weakest species ever admitted into the Galactic Accord. But paper, as one old human general once said, has never stopped a bullet. And the aliens were about to learn what that meant, the hard way. This is the story of how a single human walked into the most elite combat academy in the known galaxy, carrying nothing but a bag and a smile, and made every species in attendance question everything they thought they knew about war. The Velcor Combat Institute sat on the dark side of a moon called Earth 9. It was a cold place. The kind of cold that crept into bones and stayed there. The buildings were carved from black stone, and the hallways were wide enough for the largest species to walk through without bending. This was the most respected combat training facility in the entire Galactic Accord. Every cycle, the best young warriors from dozens of species were sent here to train together, to learn from each other, to spar, to compete. And most importantly, to prove that their species deserved a seat at the table when the Accord discussed matters of defense and military readiness. The rules of the Institute were simple. All training was done with practice steel. Practice steel was a special alloy developed by Accord scientists. It looked and felt like real metal, but it was engineered to absorb impact. A blade made from practice steel could strike flesh and leave a bruise, maybe a small cut, but it could not kill. It could not sever a limb. It could not pierce deep enough to cause real damage. Every weapon used inside the training halls had to be made from this material. No exceptions. That was the rule. That was always the rule. The current cycle had brought in 42 cadets from 11 different species. Among them were 6 Vrethkai, massive reptilian creatures who stood almost 8 feet tall and whose bodies were covered in natural armor plating that could stop a blade. There were 4 Dorvani, who had 4 arms each and could wield 2 weapons simultaneously while using their other hands to block and grapple. There were 7 Nelith, thin and fast, with eyes that could see heat signatures in complete darkness. There were Peluri, Yannek, Torathi, and several others. All of them had been chosen because they were the finest their homeworlds had to offer. And then there was the human. His name was Kale Maddox. He arrived on the last transport shuttle, 3 hours after everyone else had already settled in. He carried 1 bag over his shoulder. He wore simple grey clothing, no armor, no visible weapons, no markings of rank or family crest. He was average height for a human, maybe a little under 6 feet. His hair was dark and cut short. His face had a scar running along his left jaw, thin and white, like someone had drawn a line there with a very sharp knife a long time ago. His eyes were brown and calm. Not nervous, not excited, just calm. Like a man who had walked into rooms like this before and already knew how it was going to go. The registration officer was a Peluri named Savith. Peluri were administrative species, thin-limbed and precise, with excellent memories and a love for rules. Savith looked at Kale's file on the screen and then looked at Kale himself and then looked back at the screen. "You are the human representative," Savith said. It was not really a question. "That is correct," Kale said. "You are aware that this is a combat institute." "I am." Savith tapped the screen a few times. "Your species has only been part of the Accord for 11 cycles. This is the first time a human has been sent here. Are you certain your government understands what this program involves?" "Just a small one." "They understand." Savith stared at him for another moment and then processed his registration. He was assigned quarters on the lower level, the smallest rooms, the ones usually given to species that the Institute did not expect to last very long. Kale did not complain. He took his room key and walked away. The common hall was where the cadets gathered in the evenings. It was a large circular room with stone benches and a fire pit in the center that burned with blue flame. When Kale walked in that first night, conversations did not stop. They just shifted. Eyes moved toward him. Some curious, some dismissive. A few amused. A Vrethkai named Dren was sitting near the fire. He was enormous, even by Vrethkai standards. His scales were dark green, almost black, and his arms were as thick as Kale's entire torso. He watched the human cross the room, and sit down on a bench near the edge, alone. That is the human, Dren said to the Dorvani sitting beside him, a female named Tesserae. I see it, Tesserae said. She had all four arms crossed. Small creature. What weapon class do you think it will train in? Dren made a sound that was the Vrethkai version of a laugh. It does not matter. It will wash out before the third week. Humans are endurance species. They run, they chase, they do not fight. Not like us. On the other side of the room, a Nelith named Vale was watching Kale with more interest than the others. Nelith were observant by nature. They noticed things that other species missed, and Vale noticed something about the human that made her curious. He was sitting still, completely still. Most new cadets were restless on their first night. They shifted. They talked. They tried to make connections. The human did none of that. He sat with his hands resting on his knees and his back straight, and his eyes moving slowly around the room. Not nervously, methodically, like he was mapping every face and every exit and every possible threat in the room. Vile had seen that kind of stillness before, in soldiers, not cadets, soldiers, old ones. The kind who had seen actual combat and come out the other side of it changed. The first week of training was assessment. Every cadet was tested in basic combat forms: strength, speed, reflexes, weapons handling. The tests were designed to establish baselines so the instructors could assign appropriate training groups. Kal-El performed exactly at the middle of every test. Not the best, not the worst, exactly in the middle. His strength scores were average for a human, which put him near the bottom compared to species like the Vrethkai or Dorvani. His speed was decent, but nothing remarkable. His reflexes were good, but not exceptional. When given a practice steel sword for the first time, he held it correctly and performed the basic forms without error, but also without flair. The lead instructor was a Torathi named Commander Rickon. Torahi were broad-shouldered, six-limbed beings with hard exoskeletons and a long military tradition. Riken had been running the institute for 9 cycles and had seen hundreds of cadets come and go. He reviewed Kale's assessment scores and noted nothing unusual. Average, across the board. He placed Kale in Training Group 4, which was the second lowest group, the group for cadets who showed potential but were not expected to compete seriously. What Riken did not know, what none of them knew, was that Kale Maddox had been a soldier long before he ever set foot on Urith 9. He had served in the Terran Colonial Guard for 12 years. He had fought in the border conflicts on Kepler 7. He had been part of the strike team that held Blackridge Station for 41 days against a force that outnumbered them 8-1. He had more combat experience than most of the instructors at the Institute, but none of that was in his file. His file said he was a cultural exchange representative, a diplomat with an interest in interspecies combat traditions. That was the story Earth's government had agreed on. Because Earth's government knew something that the rest of the Accord did not. They knew that the best way to learn about your potential enemies was not to send a spy. It was to send a soldier disguised as a student and let them watch. Kale watched. That was what he did best. During the second week, the sparring began. Practice steel only. Full contact. The training halls were equipped with observation platforms where cadets not currently fighting could watch and learn. The first matches were assigned by the instructors, species against species. Vrethkai against Vrethkai. Dorvani against Dorvani. This was standard. Let each species show their traditional forms before mixing them together. Kale watched every match. He sat in the observation platform with his arms folded and his eyes tracking every movement. He watched how the Vrethkai fought. They relied on power, overwhelming force. They would charge forward, using their mass and armored bodies to break through any defense. Their practice steel weapons were massive, heavy things, great swords and warhammers that most other species could not even lift. When two Vrethkai fought, it was like watching two mountains collide. The ground shook. The sound was deafening. He watched the Dorvani. They were different, technical, precise. With 4 arms, they could attack and defend simultaneously. Their style was built around constant motion, switching between offense and defense so quickly that it was difficult to tell which was which. They used paired blades, one set for striking and one set for blocking, and they moved with a fluidity that was almost beautiful. He watched the Nelith. They were the fastest species in the room. They fought in near darkness when they could, using their heat vision to track opponents while staying invisible. Their weapons were light, thin blades and short spears, and they struck from angles that most species could not anticipate. They were assassins by nature, built for single, decisive strikes rather than prolonged combat. He watched them all, and he took notes. Not on paper, in his head. He catalogued their patterns, their weaknesses. The way the Vrethkai always dropped their left guard after a heavy swing. The way the Dorvani were vulnerable during the half-second transition between offensive and defensive arm positions. The way the Nelith always retreated to the same distance after a failed strike. Every species had patterns, and every pattern could be broken. By the end of the second week, it was time for cross-species sparring. The instructors began pairing cadets from different species against each other. This was where the real training began. This was where cadets learned to fight opponents whose bodies and styles were completely different from their own. Kale's first cross-species match was against a Junnek named Sorrel. The Junnek were medium-sized beings, roughly human proportion, but with thicker bones and denser muscle. They were considered solid, reliable fighters. Not flashy, not exceptional, but hard to put down. The match lasted 4 minutes. Kale fought conservatively. He blocked when he should have blocked. He struck when openings appeared. He won the match on points barely, with a final strike to Sorrel's midsection that the Jannek failed to deflect. It was a clean, unremarkable victory. Nobody paid much attention. Why would they? The human had beaten a Jannek by a narrow margin. It was nothing to talk about. But Vale noticed something. She had been watching from the observation platform, her dark eyes tracking every movement, and she saw what the others did not. The human had not been trying to win by as much as possible. He had been trying to win by as little as possible. Every time an opportunity for a decisive strike had presented itself, the human had pulled back, slowed down, chosen a lesser target. He was controlling the match, not just fighting in it, controlling it. Like a musician playing slightly off-key on purpose so that nobody would realize he could play the entire symphony. She said nothing about this to anyone, but she began watching Kale Maddox more closely after that, and the more she watched, the more certain she became that the human was hiding something. Something big. Something that the rest of them were not prepared for. She just did not know what it was yet. But she would find out soon enough. They all would, because inside that bag Kale Maddox had carried onto Urith 9, wrapped in cloth and sealed inside a case that no scanner at the Institute had flagged, was something that was very much not practice steel. It was old. It was heavy. It was dark iron and scarred leather, and the faint smell of oil and history. It was a weapon that had not been forged in a factory or designed by a committee. It had been made by hand, on Earth, over 400 years ago. It had been carried through wars that had shaped the entire course of human civilization. And it was waiting, quietly, patiently, for the moment when its owner would decide that the time for pretending was over. That moment was coming, and when it arrived, every species at the Velcor Combat Institute would learn a lesson that the galaxy had somehow forgotten. That humans were not weak. Humans were not soft. Humans were not average. Humans were the species that had invented war as an art form long before they ever reached the stars, and they had brought the proof with them. 3 weeks into the training cycle, the Valcor Combat Institute had settled into its rhythm. Morning drills, afternoon sparring, evening analysis sessions where instructors broke down the day's matches and pointed out flaws and strengths. It was a grind, a deliberate, calculated grind, designed to push cadets past their comfort zones and into the raw space where real growth happened. Kale Maddox continued to perform in the middle of the pack. He won some matches. He lost some matches. His record was unremarkable. 10 wins, 8 losses, 2 draws. Perfectly balanced, perfectly forgettable. The instructors barely mentioned his name during the evening sessions. He was just the human, the oddity, the species that nobody expected anything from and that was delivering exactly on that expectation. But things were beginning to shift beneath the surface. Dren, the largest of the Vrethkai cadets, had established himself as the dominant force in the training cycle. He had won every single one of his matches, most of them within the first minute. His fighting style was brutal and direct. He would close the distance immediately, swinging his massive practice steel warhammer in devastating arcs that left opponents scrambling backward. When he connected, cadets went down. Some did not get back up for several minutes. He had already sent 2 Jannek to the medical wing with fractured ribs, even through the protection of practice steel. Dren enjoyed his position at the top. He was loud about it. He made sure everyone in the common hall knew his record. He spoke about his species with pride that sometimes crossed into contempt for others. The Frethkai were warriors, he said often. Born warriors. Bred warriors. The rest of you are just playing at it. Most cadets tolerated this because Dren could back it up. He was genuinely the best fighter in the cycle by a wide margin. Even Tassari, the Dorvani with her forearms and technical precision, had lost to him. He had simply overpowered her defenses, smashed through her guard with raw strength that her technique could not counter. She had accepted the loss gracefully, but everyone could see it bothered her. The only cadet who seemed completely unbothered by Dren's dominance was KL. He never reacted to Dren's boasting, never looked impressed or intimidated. He just sat in his usual spot near the edge of the common hall, quiet and still, watching the room the way he always did. This bothered Dren more than he wanted to admit. Every other cadet in the cycle had acknowledged his superiority in some way. A nod, a step back when he walked past, a slightly lowered voice. These were small gestures, but they mattered. They were the language of hierarchy that every combat species understood. The human gave none of them. He looked at Dren the same way he looked at everyone else, with that calm, measured gaze that seemed to see everything and react to nothing. During the 4th week, Commander Riken announced a change in the training schedule. Individual challenge matches. Any cadet could challenge any other cadet to a formal sparring bout. The challenged cadet could not refuse. This was a tradition at the Institute, meant to encourage cadets to test themselves against opponents they might not normally face. The announcement was barely finished when Dren stood up. "I challenge the human," he said. The room went quiet. Not because the challenge was unexpected, everyone had seen it coming, but because of what it meant. Dren was the top-ranked fighter in the cycle. Kale was somewhere in the middle. A match between them would not be a contest. It would be a demonstration. A public reminder of the natural order. Dren wanted to make an example of the weakest-looking species in the room. Commander Riken looked at Kale. "Cadet Maddox, the challenge has been issued. Do you accept?" Kale did not hesitate. He did not look concerned. He simply nodded. "I accept." The match was scheduled for the following afternoon. Word spread quickly. By the time the training hall opened, every observation platform was full. Cadets who had no business being there had found ways to squeeze in. Even some of the instructors who were not on duty had come to watch. Everyone wanted to see what would happen when the mountain met the mouse. The training hall was a circular arena with high walls and a sand floor. The sand was packed hard enough to fight on, but soft enough to cushion a fall. Practice steel weapons were arranged on racks along the walls. Each fighter would choose their weapon before the match began. Dren entered first. He was wearing light armor over his scaled body, more out of tradition than necessity. His natural scales were better protection than anything the Institute provided. He walked to the weapons rack and picked up the largest practice steel war hammer available. It was 4 feet long, with a head the size of a melon. He swung it casually with one hand, testing its weight, and the air hummed. Kale entered from the opposite side. No armor, just his standard grey training uniform. He walked to the weapons rack and looked at the available options. Practice steel swords of various sizes, axes, peeked up from the back of the court, maces, spears, shields. He picked up a medium-length sword, single-edged, simple design. He gave it one slow swing, nodded to himself, and turned to face the arena. From the observation platform, Vale leaned forward. Beside her, Tassari was watching with all forearms folded tightly across her chest.
"This will be quick," Tassari said.
Yes, Val agreed. But she was not sure they were talking about the same kind of quick. Commander Riken stood at the edge of the arena. Standard rules, practice steel only. Match continues until one fighter yields or is unable to continue. Lethal strikes to the head and throat are forbidden. He paused and looked at both fighters. Begin. Dren charged. That was what Vrethkai did. They closed distance fast and hit hard. His massive legs drove him across the arena floor like a freight transport. The war hammer came up over his right shoulder and swung down in a diagonal arc that would have crushed anything it touched. Kale was not there. He had moved. Not dramatically. Not with the blinding speed of a Nelith. He had simply taken 2 steps to his left at exactly the right moment. The hammer struck the sand where he had been standing and sent a spray of grit into the air. Dren's momentum carried him forward. Kale did not counterattack. He reset his position, feet shoulder-width apart, sword held low, waiting. Dren turned and charged again. This time the hammer came in from the side, a sweeping horizontal strike that covered a wide arc. Kale ducked under it. The hammer passed over his head close enough to ruffle his hair. He still did not attack. He straightened up and stepped back. A murmur went through the observation platforms. The human was fast, faster than his assessment scores had suggested, but he was not fighting back. He was just avoiding. Dren growled, a deep rumbling sound that vibrated in the chest. He began a series of strikes, overhead, side, diagonal, reverse, each one powerful enough to end the fight instantly if it landed. He was trying to corner the human, cut off his escape routes, force him into a position where dodging was no longer possible. Kale moved through every attack like water flowing around stones. He did not block. A practice steel sword could not block a warhammer swung by a Vrethkai. The physics were wrong. The sword would shatter or be driven back into his own body. So he did not try. He simply moved. Small movements. Precise movements. Each one calculated to take him just outside the range of the hammer, while keeping him close enough to remain in the fight. The crowd began to notice something. Dren was getting tired, not quickly. Vrethkai had enormous stamina, but every swing of that massive hammer cost energy, and none of them were landing. The human was making him work for nothing. Each missed strike was a withdrawal from a finite account, and the balance was slowly dropping. Kale had not swung his sword once. 5 minutes into the match, Dren was breathing hard. His scales were darkened with sweat. His movements were a fraction slower than they had been at the start, and for the first time there was something in his eyes that had not been there before. Frustration. Real frustration. The kind that makes a fighter abandon strategy and start swinging wild. That was the moment Kale had been waiting for. Dren roared and brought the hammer down in a massive overhead strike, putting everything he had into it. It was the hardest he had swung all match. It was also the most predictable. Kale sidestepped to the right. As the hammer drove into the sand and Dren's arms absorbed the impact of the miss, Kale stepped forward and placed his practice steel sword against the inside of Dren's left elbow. Right at the joint where the armored scales were thinnest, he pressed. Not hard enough to injure, but hard enough to make Dren feel it. Hard enough to make him understand that if this were a real blade, his arm would be useless. Then Kale stepped back. He lowered his sword and waited. Dren stared at him. The arena was silent. Everyone had seen it. The human had had a clear strike at a vulnerable point, and instead of pressing the advantage, he had simply shown Dren that the opening existed and then backed away. This was not how you won a fight. This was how you taught a lesson. Dren charged again, angrier now, embarrassed. The next exchange lasted 30 seconds. Kale avoided 4 strikes and then placed his sword against the back of Dren's right knee. Another joint, another vulnerability in the natural armor. Again he pressed lightly and stepped away. Dren stood still in the center of the arena, chest heaving. His warhammer hung at his side. He was looking at the human with an expression that the other cadets had never seen on his face before. It was not anger. It was not frustration. It was recognition. The sudden, terrible understanding that he was not in a fight. He was in a demonstration, and he was not the one giving it. Kale stood 10 feet away. His breathing was steady. He had barely broken a sweat. His sword hung loosely at his side in a grip so relaxed it looked careless. But Vale, watching from above with her heat-sensitive eyes, could see that every muscle in the human's body was engaged. He was like a coiled spring that looked like a loose rope, ready to explode in any direction at any moment. He was not relaxed. He was so deeply controlled that relaxation was what it looked like from the outside. The third and final exchange was the shortest. Dren came forward, slower this time, more cautiously. He swung a measured horizontal strike. Kale deflected it, not blocked. Deflected. He angled his sword so that the hammer's force was redirected rather than absorbed. The hammer slid past him. And then Kale moved inside Dren's guard, past the reach of the hammer, into the space where the weapon was useless because it was too long and Dren was too close. He placed the tip of his practice steel sword against the underside of Dren's jaw, the soft spot between the chin and the throat, the one place on a Vrethkai body where there were no scales at all. Dren froze. The arena was completely silent. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Kale held the position for 3 seconds. Then he lowered his sword and stepped back. "I yield the match," he said. The silence broke into confusion. Murmurs rippled through the observation platforms. Yielded. The human had the dominant position, the killing position, and he yielded. Commander Riken stared at Kale for a long moment. Then he turned to Dren. "Cadet Dren wins by opponent yield." Dren did not celebrate. He stood in the center of the arena, looking at the human walking away, and he did not say a single word. That night, the common hall was different. The usual noise was subdued. Cadets spoke in low voices. The match was all anyone could talk about, but they talked about it the way people talk about things they do not fully understand. The human had lost, technically. But everyone who had watched knew the truth. The human had chosen to lose. He had controlled every second of that fight and then handed the victory to Dren like a gift that both of them knew was unearned. Thale found Kale sitting outside the common hall on a stone bench, looking up at the stars. The sky on Urath 9 was spectacular. No atmosphere to speak of, just a transparent dome over the Institute that let the full depth of the galaxy shine through. She sat down beside him without asking permission. "Nelith were direct that way. You could have won," she said. Kale did not look at her. "Yes, why did you not?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because winning was not the point." "Then what was the point?" Kale turned to look at her. His brown eyes caught the light of a distant nebula. "The point was to show him that his armor has gaps, not to humiliate him. If I had pressed those strikes, if I had beaten him publicly, he would have learned nothing except anger. But now he knows. He knows where he is vulnerable. And tomorrow he will start training to fix those vulnerabilities. That is worth more than a mark in my win column." Vale studied him for a long time. The cold air of Urath 9 did not bother the Nelith. Their bodies ran warm, but she noticed that the human was not shivering either, despite wearing only his thin training uniform. "What are you?" she asked. And it was not a question about his species, it was a question about what he really was. Because cultural exchange representatives did not fight like that. Diplomats did not move like that. Whatever Kale Maddox was, it was not what his file said. Kale smiled. That same small, quiet smile he had given the registration officer on his first day. "Just a student," he said. Vale did not believe him, but she let it go. For now. Over the next 2 weeks, something changed at the Institute. Dren stopped boasting. He trained harder than anyone. He spent extra hours working on the vulnerabilities that Kale had exposed, the joints in his armor, the recovery time after heavy swings. He never spoke about the match publicly, but twice Vale saw him nod to Kale in passing, a small gesture of acknowledgement that meant more than any words. Other cadets began approaching Kale, not to challenge him, to ask questions. A Dorvani wanted to know how he had redirected the hammer strike. A Jannak asked about the footwork he used to stay just outside striking range. Even a Nelith from another training group sought him out to discuss the timing of his movements. Kale helped them all, quietly, without fanfare. He would demonstrate a technique once, explain the principle behind it in simple terms, and then let the cadet practice while he watched and offered corrections. He never made anyone feel stupid. He never showed off. He taught the way a man teaches who has learned hard lessons and wants to spare others the pain of learning them the same way. Commander Riken noticed the change. He adjusted Kale's training group assignment, moving him from Group 4 to Group 2. He did not explain why, but after the next round of sparring matches, where Kale won 3 consecutive bouts with the same controlled, economical fighting style, Riken called him into his office. The office was sparse. 2 chairs. A window that looked out over the dark surface of Urath 9. Riken sat behind the desk, his exoskeleton gleaming under the overhead light. "Your assessment scores do not match your performance," Riken said. Kale sat in the chair across from him. He did not fidget. "I have been adjusting to the environment." Riken clicked his mandibles. "That was the Torathi equivalent of narrowing your eyes. You held back during assessments, deliberately. You have been holding back in every match since you arrived." Kale said nothing. Riken leaned forward. "I have been running this institute for 9 cycles. I have trained warriors from 30 different species. I know what holding back looks like, and I know what a real fighter looks like when they are pretending to be something less." He paused. "What I want to know is why." Kale met his gaze steadily. My government sent me here to learn, not to win trophies. Rickon stared at him. Then he leaned back. Your government sent a soldier, not a student. Do not insult me by pretending otherwise. He waited. When Kale did not respond, he continued, I will not expose you. Your reasons are your own and your government's. But I am telling you now that the challenge rounds are going to intensify. Next week we begin the elimination tournaments, and I want to see what you are actually capable of, not this controlled mediocrity you have been performing. He stood. The meeting was over. Dismissed. Kale stood. He walked to the door, and then he stopped and turned back. Commander, he said, if the elimination tournaments allow personal weapons, I would like to register one. Riken frowned. Personal weapons must be approved by the Institute. They must meet practice steel standards. This one will not meet practice steel standards, Kale said. Then it cannot be used. Kale reached into his jacket and pulled out a small data chip. He placed it on Riken's desk. On that chip is a formal request from Earth's government, authorized by the Accord's Military Traditions Preservation Act, Section 14, Clause 7. It permits a species representative to carry and demonstrate a historical weapon of cultural significance during formal combat exhibitions, provided that the weapon is used only against willing opponents who have been informed of the risk. Riken looked at the chip. Then he looked at Kale. What weapon? It is in my quarters, Kale said. I have been carrying it since I arrived. Riken picked up the chip. He would review it. He would check the clause. He would verify the authorization. And when he did, he would find that everything was in order, because Earth's government had planned this very carefully, every step, every detail, every legal justification. The weapon that Kale Maddox had brought to the Valcor Combat Institute was about to come out of its case, and the galaxy was about to remember something it had tried very hard to forget. That humans did not just participate in war, they perfected it. They refined it. They turned it into something that the other species of the Accord could not even comprehend. And the proof of that was wrapped in cloth and sealed in a case in a small room on the lower level of the Institute, waiting. Just like the man who carried it, patient and still, and ready for the moment when stillness was no longer enough. That moment had arrived. Commander Riken spent 2 full days reviewing the data chip. He contacted the Accord's legal department. He pulled up the Military Traditions Preservation Act and read Section 14 3 times. He consulted with 2 other senior instructors, and in the end he could not deny the request. The clause was clear. A species representative had the right to demonstrate a historical weapon of cultural significance during formal combat exhibitions. The language had been written decades ago to allow the Vrethkai to display their ancestral blade ceremonies. The Torathi had used it once to demonstrate an ancient polearm technique that had been part of their culture for 1,000 years. No one had ever imagined that a human would invoke it, but the law was the law, and it did not specify which species could use it. Riken approved the request with one condition. The weapon could only be used in the exhibition round of the elimination tournament, not in the ranked matches. The exhibition round was a tradition at the Institute. A showcase match held on the final day where cadets could demonstrate techniques or weapons outside the normal rules. It was voluntary, no rankings were affected. It was meant to be educational, a chance for species to share their martial heritage with each other. Kale agreed to the condition without argument. The elimination tournament ran for 6 days, 30 matches. The weakest cadets were eliminated first. The strongest rose through the brackets. Kale fought 4 matches in the tournament. He won all 4. Not the way he had been fighting before, with careful mediocrity. This time he fought with intent. Not full intent. Vale could still see him holding something back, but enough to show a version of himself that was closer to the truth. His first tournament match was against a Pellery who had trained extensively in staff combat. Kale disarmed him in 90 seconds. His second match was against a Nelith, not Vale, but a male named Thresh who was known for his speed. Kale matched Thresh's speed for the first 2 minutes, and then changed rhythm so abruptly that Thresh committed to a strike that was no longer aimed at anything. Kale's counter landed cleanly across Thresh's ribcage. His third match was against Tasari, the Dorvani. This one was longer. Tasari was skilled and disciplined. Her forearms made her defense almost impossible to penetrate. But Kale had watched her fight for weeks. He knew her patterns. He knew that her upper left arm always extended a fraction of a second before her lower right when transitioning from block to strike. He exploited that gap 3 times, landing precise strikes to her midsection, and won the match on points. His 4th and final tournament match was against a Vrethkai, not Dren. Dren had been eliminated in the semi-finals by a Tarathi cadet who had figured out a way to use a short spear to keep the big Vrethkai at distance. The Vrethkai Kale faced was named Goran, younger than Dren, faster, less experienced but more aggressive. The match lasted 7 minutes. Kale took 2 hits during the fight, one to his left shoulder and one to his ribs, both from Goran's practice steel sword. They left deep bruises that would ache for days. But Kale landed 11 clean strikes in return, targeting the same joint vulnerabilities he had demonstrated against Dren weeks earlier. Goran yielded after the 8th minute, breathing hard and covered in welts. Kale finished the tournament ranked 3rd overall, behind the Torathi cadet who had beaten Dren and a Dorvani from Training Group 1 who had been dominant all cycle. 3rd place, respectable for any species, remarkable for a human. The cadets and instructors acknowledged it with a mix of surprise and grudging respect. But everyone knew that the real event was still coming. The exhibition round, the final day of the cycle, arrived under the cold stars of Orith 9. The training hall had been arranged differently for the exhibition. The arena was the same, but the observation platforms had been expanded. Additional seating had been brought in. Several high-ranking officers from Accord member species had traveled to the Institute to observe the exhibitions. This was not unusual. The exhibition round was a diplomatic event as much as a martial one. Species used it to display their heritage, to remind the Accord of their warrior traditions. 3 exhibitions were scheduled before Kale's. The first was a Vrethkai blade ceremony performed by Dren and 2 other Vrethkai cadets. It was impressive. A choreographed sequence of strikes and blocks using traditional Vrethkai greatswords, accompanied by a deep rhythmic chanting that made the stone walls vibrate. The second was a Nelith stealth demonstration. 3 Nelith cadets moved through an obstacle course in complete darkness, striking targets that were revealed only by heat signatures. The crowd watched their movements on thermal displays. It was elegant and efficient. The third was a Torathi polearm form, ancient and precise, performed by the cadet who had won the tournament. Then Commander Riken stepped to the edge of the arena. The final exhibition of this cycle is a historical weapons demonstration by Cadet Kale Maddox representing Earth. He paused. Under the Military Traditions Preservation Act, Cadet Maddox has received authorization to demonstrate a weapon of cultural and historical significance to the human species. This weapon is not practice steel, it is an authentic historical artifact. All observers should be aware that this demonstration involves a live weapon. No sparring will take place. This is a solo exhibition only. A murmur ran through the crowd. Not practice steel. A live weapon. In the training hall, some of the visiting officers shifted uncomfortably. The Vrethkai officers looked intrigued. The Peluri officers looked concerned. Kale walked into the arena carrying a long case made of dark material. He set it on the sand in the center of the arena and knelt beside it. He did not look at the crowd. He did not acknowledge the murmurs or the stares. He was focused entirely on the case. He unlatched it and opened it. Inside, resting on a bed of dark cloth, was a sword, but it was unlike any practice steel weapon the cadets had ever seen. The blade was slightly curved, single-edged, and just over 2 feet long. It was dark, almost black, with a subtle grain pattern in the metal that caught the light like flowing water. The handle was wrapped in aged leather, dark brown, worn smooth by centuries of hands gripping it. The guard was a simple circular disc of iron, undecorated. There was no ornamentation anywhere on the weapon, no jewels, no engravings, no gold or silver. It was purely functional. Every line, every curve, every element of its design existed for one reason only: to cut. Kale lifted the sword from the case with both hands. He held it in front of him and was still for a moment. Then he stood. He turned to face the observation platforms and spoke clearly. His voice was calm, but it carried through the entire hall. This weapon was forged on Earth approximately 430 years ago. It was made by a swordsmith in a region called Seki, in the nation once known as Japan. It is a katana, a type of sword that was carried by a class of warriors called samurai, who served as the military nobility of Japan for nearly 700 years.
He paused.
This particular blade has a name. In the tradition of Japanese swordsmiths, the finest blades were given names. This one is called Kurokami. It means Black God. He lowered the sword to his side. The crowd was completely silent. Even the visiting officers were leaning forward. The samurai did not fight the way most species fight, Kale continued. They did not rely on armor. They did not rely on overwhelming force. They built their entire martial philosophy around a single concept: one strike, one kill. They trained their entire lives to deliver a single perfect cut. Not many cuts. Not a flurry of strikes. One. Because they understood something that most warriors across the galaxy have not yet learned. That combat is not about how many times you can hit your opponent. It is about whether you can end the fight in a single moment of absolute precision. He stepped to the center of the arena. 3 practice targets had been set up. Thick cylinders of compressed synthetic material that approximated the density of organic tissue. They were used for weapons testing. Each one was about the width of a torso. Kale stood before the first target. He held the katana in a 2-handed grip, the blade angled downward and to his right. His feet were set in a wide stance. His body was still. His breathing slowed until his chest barely moved. The entire arena seemed to hold its breath with him. Then he moved. It was not fast in the way the Nelith were fast, a blur of motion that the eye could not track. It was fast in a different way. It was fast because there was nothing wasted. No excess movement, no wind-up, no preparation. The blade went from its resting position to cutting through the target in what seemed like a single heartbeat. There was a sound, a clean singing hiss that echoed off the stone walls, and the top third of the target slid sideways and fell to the sand. The cut was so clean that for a moment the 2 pieces stayed together, separated by a line so thin it was almost invisible. Nobody made a sound. Kale moved to the second target. This time his stance was different. The blade was held high, above his right shoulder tip pointed back. Another moment of complete stillness. Then the cut came. Diagonal this time, from upper right to lower left. The target split apart, and both halves toppled in opposite directions. Again, the cut was perfect, smooth, through the entire width of the target without any deviation or hesitation. The third target was different. It was reinforced. The instructors had added a layer of synthetic armor plating around it, similar in density to Vrethkai scales. This had been Rickon's idea. He wanted to see what the blade could do against real resistance. Kale looked at the reinforced target. He adjusted his grip on the katana. He took a breath and let it out slowly. Then he settled into a low stance, the blade held horizontally at his left hip, edge facing outward. This was a drawing cut, the most fundamental technique of Japanese swordsmanship. The strike that began from stillness and ended in stillness. The technique that samurai had practiced 10,000 times until it became as natural as breathing. He drew the blade across the target in a single horizontal arc. The sound was different this time. Deeper. The synthetic armor resisted for a fraction of a second and then gave way. The blade passed through it, and through the material beneath it, and out the other side. The top half of the reinforced target slid off and hit the sand with a heavy thud. The armor plating had been cut as cleanly as everything else. The arena erupted, not in cheers, in something more complicated than that. In shock and awe and a kind of primal recognition that every warrior species in the room could feel in their bones. That blade was real. That skill was real. And the creature holding that weapon was not a student or a diplomat or a cultural exchange representative. He was a warrior carrying 4 centuries of perfected violence in his hands. Kale turned to face the crowd. He held the katana at his side, the blade still clean because the synthetic material left no residue on properly forged steel. He waited until the noise settled. This sword, he said, was carried by a man named Tanaka Hideyoshi during a conflict on Earth called the Boshin War. It was one of the last wars in which samurai fought with traditional weapons before our civilization transitioned to gunpowder and eventually to the weapons we use today. Tanaka carried this blade through 11 engagements. He survived them all. When the war ended and the age of the samurai came to a close, he wrapped this sword in cloth and placed it in a wooden case and gave it to his son. And his son gave it to his son. And so on, for over 400 years, through world wars and famines and plagues and the expansion of humanity into space. He held up the katana so the light caught the grain of the blade. My government could have sent me here with a plasma rifle, with powered armor, with weapons that make this look like a toy. Humanity has weapons that could glass the surface of this moon from orbit, but they did not send those things. They sent this, because this sword represents something that no amount of technology can replace. It represents the idea that a single human, with nothing but a blade and a lifetime of discipline, can be the most dangerous thing in any room they walk into. Not because of the weapon, because of what is behind the weapon. The will, the patience, the thousands of hours of training, the willingness to commit everything to a single moment. He lowered the blade. Every species in this room is strong, he said. I have watched you all fight for weeks. The Vrethkai are powerful beyond anything I have faced before. The Dorvani are more technically skilled than any human could match with 4 arms. The Nelith are faster and can see in ways we cannot. Every one of you has advantages that humans do not have. And that is exactly why humans learned to fight the way we do. Because we had to. On our world, we were not the strongest. We were not the fastest. We did not have armor or claws or venom. We had nothing except our minds and our refusal to stop. So we took combat and we turned it into something else. We turned it into art, into philosophy, into a discipline so refined that a single cut from a sword forged 400 years ago can still pass through modern armor plating as if it were not there. He sheathed the katana. The blade slid into its scabbard with a whisper that carried through the silent arena. Humans do not want war, he said. We have seen too much of it. We have records of our wars going back thousands of years. Millions of our people have died in conflicts that we started ourselves. We are not proud of this, but we are not ashamed of it either, because those wars taught us something. They taught us that the species which fights hardest is not the one with the best weapons or the strongest body. It is the one that refuses to quit. The one that will adapt and learn and endure long after every logical calculation says they should have surrendered. That is what it means to be human. We do not stop. We never stop. And when we carry a weapon, even an old one, even a relic from an age that ended centuries ago, we carry all of that with us. Every lesson, every scar, every war, all of it. He picked up the case and placed the katana back inside it. He latched it closed. Thank you for allowing me to share this with you, he said. And then he walked out of the arena without looking back. The silence lasted for a long time after he left. Commander Riken stood at the edge of the arena and did not speak. The visiting officers sat in their seats and did not speak. The cadets on the observation platforms did not speak. Everyone was processing what they had just witnessed. Not just the demonstration, not just the blade cutting through reinforced targets like they were air, but the words, the meaning behind them. The quiet, absolute certainty in the human's voice when he spoke about his species and what they were capable of. Dren was the first to move. He stood up from his seat on the observation platform and walked down to the arena floor. He crossed the sand to where the 3 targets stood, 2 of them in pieces, the reinforced one split clean. He ran one massive, scaled finger along the edge of the cut in the armored target. It was smooth, perfectly smooth, like it had been cut by a laser, not a blade. He stood there for a long time. Then he turned and walked away without saying anything to anyone. That night, the common hall was full but quiet. Cadets spoke softly. The usual post-tournament energy was absent, replaced by something more thoughtful. Several cadets approached Kale during the evening, not to congratulate him, to ask questions, real questions, about Earth's martial traditions, about the samurai, about how a species with no natural weapons had developed fighting systems sophisticated enough to cut through alien armor plating with a hand-forged blade. Kale answered every question patiently and thoroughly. He spoke about the different martial traditions of Earth, not just the samurai. He spoke about the knights of medieval Europe, who had developed an entire system of armored combat designed to fight opponents covered head to toe in steel. He spoke about the Shaolin monks of China, who had turned empty hand combat into a discipline that took decades to master. He spoke about the Spartans, who had built an entire civilization around the idea that every citizen was a warrior first and everything else second. He spoke about the Maori, who carved weapons from bone and jade and fought with a ferocity that terrified every enemy they ever faced. He spoke about all of these things without arrogance, without boasting. He spoke about them the way a man speaks about his family, with love and respect, and a deep awareness of both the beauty and the tragedy of what they had created. Vale sat beside him through most of the evening. When the crowd thinned and only a few cadets remained, she asked him one final question. Why did you really come here, Kale? He looked at her. His brown eyes were tired but warm. The scar on his jaw was a thin white line in the firelight. I came here because my people believe that the best way to prevent war is to make sure everyone understands what war actually is, he said. Not the sanitized version, not the practice steel version, the real thing, with real blades and real consequences and real history behind it. If the species of the Accord understand what humans are capable of, then maybe they will think twice before starting a fight. And if they understand that we would rather teach than fight, that we would rather share our knowledge than use it against them, then maybe we can build something better than just another military alliance. Maybe we can build actual trust. Vale considered this. And the sword, Kurakami. Will it go back in its case now? Kale nodded. It goes back in its case. It is not meant to be used. Not anymore. It is meant to be remembered. There is a difference. The cycle ended 2 days later. Cadets returned to their homeworlds. Reports were filed. Assessments were finalized. In the official records of the Valcourt Combat Institute, Cale Maddox was listed as having finished third in the elimination tournament and as having performed a cultural exhibition on the final day. The records noted that his exhibition involved a historical weapon of cultural significance, nothing more. But the unofficial record, the one that traveled through barracks and war rooms and officers' clubs across the Accord, told a different story. It told the story of a human who walked into the toughest combat school in the galaxy and spent weeks pretending to be average, who fought the biggest, strongest fighter in the room and chose to lose after proving he could win, who pulled a 400-year-old sword out of a case and cut through alien armor like it was made of paper, and who then stood in front of every warrior species in the known galaxy and explained calmly and clearly exactly why humanity was not a species to be underestimated. The story spread. It changed in the telling, as stories do. Some versions said the human cut through 10 targets, some said 20. Some said he fought Dren with the katana and won in 3 seconds. The details shifted, but the core message remained the same. Do not mistake human kindness for weakness. Do not mistake their soft bodies for fragility. Do not mistake their willingness to lose for inability to win. Because behind every smile, behind every offer of friendship, behind every diplomatic handshake, there is a species that spent 10,000 years learning how to destroy everything in its path and then chose, deliberately and with full knowledge of what it was giving up, to try peace instead. And somewhere in the lower levels of the Institute, in a small room that had already been cleaned for the next cycle's occupant, a case sat on an empty shelf. Inside it, wrapped in cloth, a blade named Kurokami rested in darkness. It had been carried across 400 years of human history, and then across the stars themselves. It had been held by hands that could end a life in a single stroke, and now it was still, waiting, as it had always waited. Not for war, not for blood, but for the next moment when someone needed to be reminded of what humanity was, what it had been, and what it could become, if pushed. The galaxy had received its reminder, and it would not forget.